So I'll let you know when we're connected. Okay, we are connected.
All right, good evening. I'm Richard Nobles, and I serve as chair of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. And I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and by other electronic medium. Linda Heitzman-Powell, she's not going to be here this evening. David Stevens.
Here.
Abby Callis is not going to join us this evening. Mark Goodman.
Mark,
You're muted, but I do acknowledge you. I see you there. Matt Golker.
Here.
Jessica Hamilton.
Here.
Edward Hunter.
Present.
Tiffany Johnson.
Here.
Sarah Kirk.
Here.
Rodney McNeil may not be joining us this evening. Jay Middleton.
Here.
And Doug Wright is not going to be joining us this evening. I also note that the following staff members are also present: David Fine.
Here.
And Leslie Allen. All right. Next, David Fine will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Richard. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individual is requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. We will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On February 16th, 2024, we sent notice of all advisory committee meetings to individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allow members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by sending an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check it before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone enter the room that way, I'll let you know.
Thank you. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda, which is to approve the agenda. I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
I motion to approve the agenda.
Jay moves to approve. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Both Jess and Sarah moved to second. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed,
Aye.
same sign. The motion carries. The second item on the agenda is to review and approve the minutes from our last meeting. That's February 13, and those were sent to you previous to today's meeting. Are there any revisions that need to be done to the minutes from our previous meeting? All right, seeing none, I'll take a motion to approve the minutes from the February 13, 2024 meeting.
Motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
Let's see. Jay got in before Ned, so I'll take Jay as having moved. Do I have a second?
Well, then I'll second.
And Ned seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please, same sign. All right, that motion carries. The third item on the agenda is the executive director's report. I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay now? I'm sorry. It's Mark.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard. I'll go over some operations updates first. We are experiencing a time where a lot of students are getting ready to graduate from their programs around the state. So we are helping our licensing staff prepare for an increase in applicants. And also, Leslie and I, the assistant director and licensing manager for the board, we are setting up a lot of appointments with different groups of students at schools. We do a presentation for a lot of programs to talk about the licensing path and help answer a lot of questions for students so that process can go as smoothly as possible. We also inform them about unprofessional conduct regulations and requirements of licensed practitioners under the board, kind of make them aware of that process as well and help them avoid any disciplinary issues. And then we talk to them about resources on the BSRB website. So we've been able to talk to a number of different groups of students and excited about them being so close to graduating and happy to provide this outreach on behalf of the board. Additionally, in terms of outreach, I was invited recently to speak to a group of individuals that are part of the Governor's Behavioral Health Center of Excellence in Wichita, Kansas. And I was able to provide information on a lot of the improvements in the licensure process and changes the board has put into place in the statutes and regulations that the BSRB oversees over the last few years. There were a number of really positive updates, and I was able to present information to that group. They wanted me to pass along back to the board that they are very appreciative of the efforts the board has made to look at the workforce challenges around the state and also the modernized approach to licensing and supervision, allowing more of that to be done remotely. So they have basically wanted to communicate back that they have seen those changes and they are very appreciative of those and wanted to compliment the work of the board and also, you know, the work of the advisory committees that assist the board, because a lot of those items the board had put into place started with discussions that the advisory committees have and then forward those recommendations to the board. So I wanted to communicate that to you and I'll be letting the board know about those positive comments as well. Another update I thought I'd go ahead and make in terms of operations for the agency. We talked about trying to modernize the approach to licensure and trying to make positive changes and updates. The BSRB will be undergoing a change to our website. In the next month or so, we'll be moving under a new platform for a company called Granicus that is providing some other state websites. And this should make our website more accessible for individuals, especially with mobile devices. We're trying to make it a little bit easier for people to navigate and find the right resources on the website. And so, like I said, that change should be happening in about a month. One of the major takeaways, though, is that we are not changing the address for the website. They should still be able to go to the same place to get all the information that people are already receiving. It'll just look a little bit different on our front page. And so that tentatively scheduled to happen the first week in May. And we're hoping that process will go smoothly. A few of us here at the office have been doing some training to make sure that we're able to make adjustments to the website. And we will continue to receive assistance from the Office of Information Technology Services as well. Turning now to some updates from a previous board meeting. The board last met on March 11th, 2024, and I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of some of the discussions taking place at the last board meeting. We are getting close to reaching an agreement with a company called CE Broker. That is a company that partners with licensing boards and allows a voluntary option for individuals to create accounts and upload their documentation of continuing education hours completed, so that if they are selected for audit, the licensing board can pull those records and do the audit much more quickly. And is also a benefit to the licensees, so that they don't have to hang on to those stacks of paper for years, sometimes not knowing if they will be pulled for audit or need to access those resources. So the Board of Healing Arts, Board of Nursing have already reached agreements with this company. We are in the final stages We've already been going through documentation in terms of a data sharing agreement and the master service agreement. We're just trying to make sure that we have appropriate terms and that there's good language in there for different items. So, but I think probably in the next few months we'll be finishing that item up. Additionally,
Hey, David, can I ask a question?
sure.
I know you mentioned nurses and physicians, and a lot of times these companies seem very well designed for those practitioners, but not psychologists, like supervision, involved in therapy, whatever the specific requirements are for the state. I take it that you're going to be working with them on what those are, so it's not a platform that basically doesn't fit oranges when it's designed for apples.
Yeah, so basically what they have done is they've gone through our statutes and regulations and they've looked to see how many hours are required for each one of the professions and the levels of licensing for the professions. And there is a way that people can go through and upload the documentation of continuing education, and then they can also assign it in certain categories. So for the 3 hours of ethics, they can say, here are my documentation, and these three documents go towards ethics. They can kind of put it in those categories. Or this is my 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment, so I'm going to assign that. The ultimate decision on whether those meet will still rest with the BSRB, but it will allow people to go ahead and put that into a portal we can easily access. So that's kind of one of the services they provide. And then if people are going to renew their license, if they have an account with the e-broker, essentially as part of that renewal process, there will be a way to check to see if they have all of those documents uploaded in the portal. If they don't, they will still be able to move forward if they want to, but the e-broker will essentially say, you know, you might want to double check to make sure you've completed all of your hours, because based on what we have, either you have enough hours or you don't have enough hours, but that will still need to be confirmed by the board if you're pulled for audit. So it's a way for people to double check, but it should be a nice benefit. But ultimately, the decision will still rest with the BSRB. So we will still be the ones that are be checking those documents. It's just this will cut down on the time frame in terms of people mailing or sending those materials to the board, us having to review it, and then sending some of those back from time to time. Another item, the board has been talking about background check requirements for some of the different compacts that have been passed. A lot of these multi-state compacts require individuals who practice under the compact to have undergone a background check as a condition for licensure or a condition to practice under the compact. The board received authority to make it a requirement for all licensees to have a background check as a condition of licensure, but that was never made a requirement for licensees. And so we know that some of the individuals licensed by the board will need to have a background check at some point as a condition of practicing under the compact. The question really for the board to discuss is whether they want to move forward and have this be a background check requirement for all levels of license, or to hold off and just have it for the individuals practicing under the compacts for those professions. Additionally, the board received a presentation by a company called Acela, which is a licensing system vendor. The state of Kansas passed a bill last year to create a unified license verification portal for all licensing bodies in the state of Kansas, so that if someone wants to know if a person is licensed by any of the different professions, they can go to one spot, type in the person's name, and then see if they're licensed by the Board of Healing Arts or Board of Nursing or BSRB. As part of that bill passing, there was a contract provided to Acela to put together an enterprise licensing system for any agencies in the state of Kansas who would want to move to that license verification, to that licensing system. There's about 5 or 6 that have already made that decision to move over, but the board is considering whether it would make sense for the BSRB to move to that new platform. As I mentioned, they received a presentation by Acela at the last board meeting, and there's probably going to be some further discussion at the upcoming board meeting whether it makes sense from a financial perspective, and then also for some of the resources that company can provide. There are some benefits I can see in terms of being able to connect certain functionalities that right now we do in a manual sense. There also would be kind of a cleaner pathway to having an online license application as part of that too. There would be a higher upfront cost to transition to the new licensing system, but based on the information that we have, over the long run, it would be a cheaper year-to-year cost. So over the long run, there would be some savings as we stay with that company for a long enough period of time. So there's different things for the board to weigh, but further discussion at the next board meeting on that topic. Additionally, the board passed a delegation motion, which should help with efficiency and the BSRB reviewing applications for certain individuals. There is some language that states if certain individuals applying for licensure, if we are unable to get a practicum reference because those individuals received their education so long ago, the practicum supervisor was either deceased or not available and the school can't locate them. How should those cases be handled? And right now, what we've been doing is holding those, have the board review them, and if there is a demonstration that that is a situation that has occurred, the board is able to approve those and move them forward. Recently, the board passed some delegation language to allow staff of the BSRB to go ahead and move those cases forward without needing to hold them for board review. So that should help with some of the speed of processing for some of those rare cases that fit into that category. Additionally, the board had a discussion about jurisprudence examinations. Those are required in certain states as a requirement for licensure or sometimes for a requirement for renewal. Jurisprudence examinations are a way to help make sure that licensees are knowledgeable about the laws of the state and that they understand certain issues and certain technicalities and laws that govern the practice of certain professions. And so the board is having a discussion about whether jurisprudence examinations should be required in Kansas, and if so, how best to maybe implement those for the different professions. They have deferred that to the advisory committees to have conversations about, and I think we're going to have a conversation about that later on the agenda today. And then the last item for the board meeting on March 11th, the board seeks to have an all-day planning meeting in person once a year. This is for topics that require in-depth discussion by the board, and sometimes it involves items for the board's legislative agenda. And so this year they've set the date of that one-day meeting for Monday, September 30th, 2024. We don't have a lot of the logistics determined yet, but we're going to try to have that meeting in Lawrence, Kansas. 2 years ago, the meeting was in Kansas City. Last year it was in Wichita. So we try to move this meeting around the state. And even though we are not able to broadcast this meeting, usually based on the resources of the facilities we go to, it is an open meeting. So if any individuals from the public would like to attend this meeting, they're welcome to do so. And last year in Wichita, we did have some public attendees. So that meeting again will be on Monday, September 30th, 2024. And then as more details are determined, we'll put this on the website so people know where to go for that meeting. And then turning last to some legislative updates, I did want to let you know that the House and Senate have passed a budget bill for the state of Kansas. They are currently at a time period to where they have left for about a 2-week break where the governor is reviewing a lot of other bills that the legislature passed. If the governor vetoes any of those bills, what happens after about 2 weeks is the legislature will return and they will have the opportunity to decide if they want to override or attempt to override any vetoed bills. In terms of the budget for the BSRB, every September we submit a budget. We don't receive money from the state, but the legislature does pass a limitation on how much we can spend every year. And as part of that process, we actually put forward a proposed limit. The governor makes recommendations on that, and then the House and the Senate each have a separate committee that reviews that, and then it kind of moves through the process. So the information that we provided to the House and the Senate and the governor's office, there was no change from what the agency requested. So those amounts have moved forward this year in the appropriations bill. There was some comments made by the Senate committee when they reviewed the BSRB's budget. We have one fund for the agency. We're a smaller agency, and so we have one fee fund, and that receives revenue from licenses primarily that we issue. And then over the years, the balance in the fee fund back in the 2010s was growing. And back in 2019, the board put in some pretty aggressive fee decreases. It decreased application fees and license renewal fees by about $50 each for both types of fees back in 2019. And since that time, the balance in the BSRB fee fund has decreased from about 2.3 million down to about 1.9 million. And it is projected to further decrease based on those fee decreases put forward in 2019. The board knew at the time they put those fee decreases in that eventually they would need to revisit that topic. Those were basically designed to create a deficit for the agency to draw down the balance in the BSRB fee fund. Right now, our yearly operating expenditures wise is about $1.2 million. And so at about 1.9 million, the goal is that we can allow that to come down slowly over time, and it's to the benefit of licensees if we can prolong that time period so that we won't have to revisit raising fees to reach an equilibrium. So in the meanwhile, we are trying to avoid any further revenue losses to make sure that the long period of time happens before we have to increase fees. But there's a number of factors involved with that. The Senate heard this information, saw our decreased fee fund balance and our projections, and they complimented the board on the actions the board took to lower fees, and were very complimentary of that. The House saw that the balance was still close to about 2 million at the time of the budget hearing, and they requested a report from the board looking at other ways to possibly reduce fees further. So the board had a special board meeting in February, discussed the history of fee decreases, the current balance in the fund. Also, we tried to collect information from other licensing boards to look at how our fees compare to those in other states. And ultimately, what the board saw was when the fee decreases were put into place back in 2019, they were put in for all the professions except the behavior analyst profession. So the board went ahead and made a recommendation to put forward an additional fee decrease for the behavior analyst and the assistant behavior analyst, which would make that consistent with the other fee decreases put in back in 2019. Additionally, the board made a recommendation to collect additional information on fees in different states to make an informed decision. And the board noted that there were a number of compacts that had recently passed in Kansas, such as SIPAC, the Professional Counseling Multi-State Compact, and there was a social work compact before the legislature this year as well. And based on how those would impact the state, the board wanted to collect additional information on the revenue impact or potential loss of revenue for joining those multi-state compacts. So the board elected to continue to research the topic and then to consider maybe additional actions at the July board meeting or at the September board meeting before the budget is submitted for the next fiscal year cycle. When the budget bill was being worked, there was sort of an odd proviso that was temporarily put on the budget for the BSRB by the House. There was a recommendation by a member of the House Appropriations Committee, which would have prohibited the BSRB from enforcing a regulation that had to do with some requirements for licensure from individuals who attended non-accredited schools for social work. However, when I learned about that amendment that had been put on the bill, I believe there was a fair amount of confusion about that. And so I reached out to leadership in House Appropriations Committee. I also reached out to the member of the legislature who made that motion. Some of the comments that were said in committee didn't seem to match the facts as I knew them. So I also reached out to the school that was alleged to be affected by that. And like I said, I believe there was a fair amount of confusion about that topic. The item that the board was taking action on for the social work profession was actually a proposed regulation intended to open up one of the requirements for licensure for the individuals from non-accredited schools to allow it to be easier for online programs to meet that requirement. So through the communication, I believe that there was better understanding. And when that bill was worked on the House floor, the maker of that motion made a second motion to remove that proviso from the BSRB budget. So long story short, that item was not on the budget when it entered the conference committee process, but I appreciate the members of the legislature really trying to understand the complex nature of some of those regulatory changes and appreciate their partnership in this process. And so we were able to resolve that issue. But ultimately, where we stand right now, the House and Senate have both passed the budget bill. It has been sent to the governor's office, or if it has not yet, it will be very shortly. The governor does have authority to make line item vetoes to the appropriations bill. So that generally does occur. And so when that happens, the legislature, when they come back, they'll have the opportunity potentially to take action on any line item vetoes. But essentially, the majority of the budget probably has been completed so far this year. When they come back after their break, they generally do a smaller budget bill for cleanup type items, but it's a much smaller item. So we'll be keeping an eye on anything that comes up in the short period of time when they come back. But ultimately, a lot of that budget process has been completed. I mentioned there was a social work compact bill before the legislature this year. That was House Bill 2484. And that compact was set up very differently than the other compacts for the mental health professions. SIPAC, as you're aware, created a version where psychologists would have to have a license in their home state and then would be able to apply to the SIPAC Commission for the authority to do telehealth services into other states or the ability to do a limited number of days of in-state practice in other states. But you may be aware, you have to do an e-passport to get approval to practice under SIPAC authority. There's also a certain cost that you pay to the SIPAC Commission, depending on what type of practice you want to do. And then there's a renewal fee as part of that process too. With the social work multi-state compact, this is designed to essentially, in the place of that, allow states the ability to issue a multi-state license. So your existing licenses would be treated as a single state license, allowing you to practice in just where the state that you live. But now states could issue a multi-state license for a higher amount. And if you had a multi-state license, you could practice in all other states that are part of the compact. The issue is that when that went before the legislative committee, the original bill had some language that would have allowed the BSRB the authority to set an appropriate fee for those multi-state licenses within a cap. That was replaced by some general language, which basically said you would still need to have a permanent license, and then the fee to be able to practice in any of these multi-state jurisdictions would be $25 above whatever your permanent license costs. And if that amount sounds too good to be true, it's because, in my opinion, it is. We've run the numbers to look to see how much revenue we expect to lose from individuals that are currently licensed that live outside of the state of Kansas. Based on losing those individuals who are likely to get a multi-state license in the state where they live, it should be a revenue loss to the BSRB of about $150,000 every 2 years. And that's a pretty conservative estimate that just looks at the license renewal fees for individuals that are currently licensed that live out of state in the social work profession. It doesn't include anybody who won't be applying to the BSRB in terms of application fees or original licensure fees. It just looked at their license renewal fees. The $25 charge that ultimately was passed as part of House Bill 2484 would potentially amount to about $100,000 for the BSRB every 2 years. So it would still leave the BSRB at a deficit of about $50,000 every 2 years based on the way that compact was passed. Looking at those numbers, we saw that was going to be an issue, and we attempted to talk to the legislature and explain the details, but there was some other information that was put out there by individuals that was not accurate. And unfortunately, the legislature did decide to go with the $25 amount. That will lead to, like I said, additional decrease in revenue for the BSRB, and unfortunately, it will speed up the time frame to where the board will need to consider raising fees for licensees. But the next step is for that compact to actually become active, and that will take a little bit of time, and then we'll be able to see sort of how many people switch from the single state license to the multi-state license. But yeah.
Oh, may I just ask a real quick question?
Sure.
How many dollars above the 1,200,000 a year will they allow you to have working with? I mean, it's $1,200,000 a year is your budget. Will they allow like 1,500,000? A little bit of a, an area where you'd have a little bit of cushion, or do you know the answer to that question?
The legislature discussed that this year. They've never come to a definitive conclusion about that for agencies. But what was talked about in committees by a few people this year is perhaps having 1 year's expenditures as a balance in the fee fund would be appropriate. And I can, one of the reasons I think that might make sense is because while we hope it never happens again, during the pandemic that occurred, there were a series of executive orders by the governor's office that prohibited agencies from enforcing the expiration of licensure. And so during that time period, if individuals kept practicing but didn't renew their license, the states couldn't enforce the expiration. And so for some states, agencies, they weren't able to collect a lot of their revenue for that year or longer that occurred. The BSRB had a little bit better of a system, in my opinion. We had a 2-year license period, but for some of the agencies that had a 1-year license period, they really were in trouble with their revenue flow because of when that occurred. So right now, our yearly expenditures are about 1.2 million. The balance in the fund is about 1.9 million. So I think probably drawing that down from 1.9 to about the 1.2. I think at that point, I would probably encourage the board to start taking a look at seeing what actions would need to take place to balance revenue and expenditures. But the legislature has not given a definitive answer. There's been comments one way or the other.
I just wish that they could have it above the 1.2 in case something happens, 1.4, 1.5 or something. My opinion, that would be reasonable. I'm just giving my own opinion from a financial standpoint. That's all.
Sure. Well, and I think what they've paid attention to in the past has been agencies where the fee fund balance is growing. And I think back when it was growing back in 2019 on a yearly basis, I think the actions the board took are very appropriate to look to make fee decreases to draw down the balance slowly over time. And I can tell you from an operational standpoint here at the BSRB, we don't want to have wasteful spending. And so if there's
Right.
things that we can look for in terms of potentially federal grants that would take the place of certain things, like we got some technology from some of the COVID related funds, or if there's an opportunity, let's say, for example, at one of the National Association meetings, for me to speak on a topic and it saves the agency a little bit of money in terms of travel reimbursement, I'm happy to do that just to kind of save the agency a little bit of money. So we're trying to make effort to, if we don't have to spend the money, we don't, we try not to, while still making sure that we're spending money appropriately. But the longer we can go before we get down to that level, the better it's going to be for everyone.
Yes,
We've been
yes.
trying to communicate that message.
Okay, thank you for that.
But that multi-state compact for the social workers, it has passed the House, it has passed the Senate, and even though the final version of that wasn't what I think would be the best model, it really will be a good thing for the public. It is now with the governor's office to take action on, and I fully expect the governor to sign that into law. I do think this will open up a lot of pathways for people to provide mental health services into the state of Kansas. It will also provide ways for our social workers to be able to provide better continuity of care to individuals. I did hear from some people that it's not just about practitioner mobility, it's also about, you're helping someone out and they go to college in a different state. Well, under this compact, as long as that other state is a member of the compact, you'd be able to continue to provide services to them without any kind of interruption. Or someone moves to a different state. And so there can be some real big benefits here. So I don't want to lose track of that. I just kind of want to make you aware that this is something we pay close attention to, and we try to be good stewards of the money in terms of the license revenue we receive. And so we're very big supporters. The board is a big proponent of the bill, looking forward to having it be implemented. But in terms of that time frame, if the governor does sign it into law, they will need to have their compact commission meet and then work out rules for the commission. They will probably need to put together sort of a data system to keep track of everybody practicing with a multi-state license so that the public is informed, is this person authorized to provide services? So there'll be a number of these logistics to work out, also the background check item as well. And so when all those things get worked out, then the compact will be able to become functional. So I think perhaps a year might be reasonable, maybe a little bit longer. Hopefully we're learning some efficiencies from the other compacts that have been started recently. For example, the professional counseling multi-state compact passed last year, and it is still not operational, but they have a goal to have that compact be operational in November or December of this year. So if we can learn from those compacts, perhaps maybe in a year, the social work compact might be functional by that point. So do you have any questions on any of those issues before I move to just a couple other items? Okay. Well, just a couple other legislative notes I wanted to comment on. There is one item that involves the BSRB, and that is Senate Bill 307. So a few years back, there was a bill that passed that created the Kansas Fights Addiction Act, and it provided for the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. And this is a board set up to oversee money from federal lawsuits on federal opioids, and the money that the state of Kansas collects from that. This board is able to oversee and provide grants to different entities that are providing services for substance use around the state. The bill that passed this year was Senate Bill 307, and the governor has signed that into law. It would amend the number of qualified entities, and not just counting nonprofit entities, but also would now include for-profit entities if they wanted to seek some of that grant funding under the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. Additionally, I mentioned those regulatory changes that we were pursuing. Some of those have been in the works for a little bit of time now. There's a few different steps those have to meet. So we have held those proposed regulations open now for 60 days. We had a public meeting here at the BSRB office for anyone who wanted to provide additional comments. Those are now in a time period to where we have closed that process. The next step is for the board to take a roll call vote on those proposed changes to regulations. That can happen at the next full board meeting in May. And if that does happen, we'll be able to publish those in the Kansas Register, and then either 10 or 15 days after publication, those become effective. And looking forward to putting those proposed regulatory changes into law, but we're just getting close to the finish line on this item. So I realize that's a lot of information, but I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any other questions.
Any questions? All right. Seeing none, we'll move on to, excuse me, the next item on, not next item on the agenda, and that's an update on the SIPAC Commission, and I'll turn it back over to Dave.
Thank you, Richard. In your packet of material, you'll see the March newsletter for the SIPAC Commission. I went ahead and provided that to you. That has some pretty good information about the current number of states that are part of SIPAC. By my count, I believe there are 39 states now that have passed SIPAC. The compact is active in 37 of them, and then I think 2 more will become effective later on this year, or maybe at the beginning of next year. But the vast majority of states are now members of SIPAC. So that's exciting to see. In terms of individuals in Kansas utilizing SIPAC, there appeared to be sort of a leveling out of individuals practicing under the SIPAC Commission, but essentially, as of the last report, there are about 94 individuals with a license in Kansas that have Kansas as their home state that are providing telehealth services to other states under SIPAC authority. SIPAC also allows individuals to be able to practice a number of days of in-state practice, I believe up to 30 per year, if they receive authorization to do so. And there are 8 licensed psychologists that are licensed in Kansas at the home state here that provide those in-state services. So that is certainly what's going on with SIPAC. There will be a mid-year meeting coming up later this year, but no other big news for SIPAC. Just kind of want to give you an update on the numbers and let you know kind of that looks like things have kind of leveled out. We had a pretty steep uptick of growth for about the first year and a half, but now it seems like we've kind of leveled off.
Couldn't get unmuted there. No, thank you very much for that update. Any questions about what's going on with SIPAC from anyone? All right, seeing none, let's move on to old business. The first item under old business is to resume a discussion on draft regulation changes for documenting continuing education credits. And you all should have received a draft of what we are about to discuss in your packet that went out on Friday. Dave, I'll have you I'll turn it over to you here to kind of discuss what we have already done, and we can kick off our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And I think Leslie Allen will walk through most of this discussion, but just to kind of frame this conversation, as a reminder, each one of the professions has a separate regulation on the requirements for continuing education in terms of what types of activities qualify for continuing education for their profession. For most of the different 7 professions that we oversee, there was also a companion regulation that was titled the Documentation of Continuing Education that described what people could submit to prove the hours in certain categories. However, the licensed psychology profession did not have a regulation like that. And so in the past, there was some broad conversation about some of the items that could go into that and some language that could be created so we could develop a new regulation to provide better clarity and answer questions from individuals in terms of what they can submit for that. So Leslie Allen was able to draft a document for you, and it's in your packet. It's draft titled 102-1-15A, Documentation of Continuing Education. And Leslie, would you like me to go ahead and share that on the screen so you can kind of take a look at that? So I will share my screen here with that document. And Leslie, could you test your volume again to make sure that we can hear you okay?
Me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you should be 102-1-15A now. And Leslie, go ahead and just kind of explain a little bit of the work that you put into on this draft document.
So what I've done is we can't show both regulations at the same time, but the order of documentation kind of goes in order of the CEU regulation and how you can obtain CEUs. So the first one, I modeled it after professional counseling. I think that's what we used when we looked at this with your committee. and you discussed what you would like included and the types of documentation you would like to require. So the first one is obviously from a conference or a training. The second one, so a self-study program would be, it could be reading a book. It could be doing an online training without a post-test. If there's a post-test, then you would have a certificate and it would be counted differently. But oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. B is a copy of your course syllabus if you took some kind of course in a university or college, or verification from them that you completed a course. So C is the one I was trying to talk about. That's for like if you read a book or something like that. And in the committee meeting when we met, the psychology committee requested that I add the language that they would like a full biopic information about the book, including page numbers and summary on how the information can apply to their practice. And I've put that in there, but then I wanted to bring it back to the committee because our regulations don't require that your continuing education be related to your practice. So I really didn't feel like that was an appropriate addition, since we don't have that requirement. You can take anything that applies to psychology as continuing education. It doesn't have to be specific to your situation. So I wanted to bring that back and see how strongly the committee felt about that, how it relates to the practice.
All right, so that is discussion point 1. How do folks feel about what Leslie has presented with respect to the linking between what has been learned and how it relates to practice?
Well, I think as it's written, it's open to anything because it says can. But having said that, I just think that that's unnecessary and it could just be room for so much interpretation because in psychology, there's just such a wide range of things that applies to how we practice psychology. Ethics, history, research methodology. I mean, it can go on and on. So to me, to specify this just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Because who's going to decide that? Who's going to judge that? And how are they going to base that judgment? Is it operationalized? So to me, this just brings in a lot more room for difficulty for whoever's trying to interpret that.
Anybody else? I can't see folks because we're on full screen. So please chime in.
I tend to agree with Dr. Kirk, with Sarah, as far as like it just seems like unnecessary verbiage that could end up making us do a lot of like back end work with trying to figure out what our operational definition of this would be. I think people are I don't know that I feel like there's going to be a good example of where somebody's taking education classes that are not related to their area of practice in some capacity.
Yeah, I guess that was my question. Maybe it was mentioned, I didn't hear it. Has there been issues with people with them trying to apply?
Well, not as far as staff is concerned. I think that the committee was just trying to tighten it up a little bit.
And that's fair.
But there is a limited amount. I can't look at the regulation, the CEU regulation, but you can't. Generally, it's 10 hours of self-study.
It's 10.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I just didn't know if you had evidence, like if somebody's submitting like swimming or something. I mean, something, that obviously is unrelated. I would just assume not, because I think with that category, I don't know, maybe there just are a lot of people out there that are unethical, but I doubt that most people are saying, let me see what I can get by with in this category.
Right.
And I would assume the board can recognize that if that were to occur. But that's just my standpoint.
Yeah, so there's a maximum of 12 hours in that category. So it can't be, you know, the majority of the hours. It's so
I'm guessing that the issue here is like trying to avoid somebody who's maybe doing something even like taking iatrogenic type of training or something. Like I'm going to go to a training where beating your clients is supposed to help them or something like that. I think I probably agree that I don't think anybody's doing that. So you're kind of in the legalese of explaining, you know, we also shouldn't do lots of things, but nobody's trying to do that.
Mhm.
I would agree with you on that too.
So with that being said, we would strike beginning, so we see a copy of a self-study program or the full bibliographic information about the book and just period. Is that what folks are thinking?
I guess including page numbers, and then there would be a period. And then we would strike in a summary on how the information can apply to their practice.
Yeah, I think if you have the full citation and it's not a 2-page pamphlet, that, you know, you're gonna have enough information probably to evaluate it.
Okay. So then to go on with that, for the video recording, audio recording, or computerized interactive learning modules or telecast, that they would have a written statement from the licensee specifying the media format, content title, presenter or sponsor, content description, length, and activity date. And then a certificate of completion is required if it's an actual course that they took online or something like that. Otherwise, it would just be their information that they provide to the board in an audit. And then the next, if they read an article, for D, if they read an article or book chapter, a copy of the article or book chapter written by the licensee and verification of publication or written presentation at a professional meeting. And then E, if they took an academic course at a university, they would send a copy of the transcript or a statement signed by the instructor indicated the number of actual hours that the licensee attended for an audited academic course. Because the when you break down the CEUs for a university, for a college course, it's 1 hour equals 15 CEUs. So
Right.
it actually looks at the course length. F, if they a written signed verification form that from the university practicum or internship instructor or other official training director for whom the licensee supervised undergraduate or graduate students, or written, I'm sorry, there's a typo. A signed verification, including the dates of supervision from the postgrad supervisee for whom the licensee provided supervision. So you can get supervision, CEUs for supervision if you do practicum or internship students or postdoc. And that's what the information that would need to be provided. And the or a written will be struck because that shouldn't be there. I apologize about that. G, if receiving non-disciplinary supervision, you can get CEUs and you need to include a written signed verification, including the dates of supervision from the licensee who provided the supervision. And then, if you're serving on a professional organization or certifying, I'm sorry, if you're serving in a professional organization, then we would get a letter of participation in the professional organization or credentialing board. So you can get CEUs for serving on the committee. We can provide you a letter if you need one. We don't send them out generally speaking, but if you do need one, feel free to ask. And then finally, a signed statement of attendance from the provider of an institute, symposium, workshop, or seminar, and a bill of services. Dave, can you pull up the CEU regulation? So that would be when you're receiving professional psychotherapy that's part of a training program, that you would need to have that the final documentation would need to be received for that, showing that it's a training program and how that how many hours of psychotherapy you received. And you guys talked about this a lot and said that that would not be a problem, that would be a pretty simple thing or popular thing that you would be able to get.
I have a couple of questions for the group. With respect to G, in terms of someone that is receiving formal supervision, that would be delineated, or would it be delineated from consultation? And if so, would we want for the person to have a supervisory agreement of some sort?
I think there should be a supervisory agreement. I went through this with a individual that the Behavioral Science Board approved me to supervise for a 2-year period from 2019 to 2021. And we had a supervisory agreement written up between us. And we kept track, of course, of all the supervision, the times, the dates, what we discussed. And that worked out well. I mean, it was a lot of work, but it was worth it. I was able to help this individual get on his feet. So I've personally been through this 2019 to 2021 for 2 years. So I think that would be a good idea. That's my opinion for actually doing it.
And Mark, as a follow-up to that, were you supervising a fellow psychologist, or was this someone from a different profession that is under the purview of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board?
It was another psychologist from another state that the Behavioral Science Board required this individual to have 2 years of supervision by a Kansas licensed psychologist. That's who it was. That's exactly what happened.
Okay.
And we kept, I kept records, every hour of supervision I provided and what we discussed during supervision, those types of things, and the dates and everything, and kept a log for the Behavioral Science Board at that time.
So this presents an interesting situation, I think, because there are those situations where the board requires a licensee to receive mandatory supervision, as in the case of what I think Dr. Goodman is describing. And that is one thing. And then there are cases where a licensee might want to receive training in, say, a different modality of treatment than what they are used to providing. And they would want to have formal supervision by a psychologist of their own choosing. In such an instance, would we say that the relationship between those two psychologists necessitate a supervisory agreement? And if so, how? Because as far as I know, I don't know if, as far as I know, I don't know if there is a mechanism within the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board to get a supervisory agreement in that situation. How would we want to handle that sort of a situation? If it's not, essentially, if it's not mandated supervision, if it's voluntary supervision.
In my situation, it was mandated for this
Right,
individual.
and that's
Yes,
one,
that's, yes, one
and that's
scenario.
one bucket of things. Like that's
Yes.
But as far as I know, I don't think that we don't have a mechanism for voluntary supervision. We have consultation, and the way that this is described or is
Yeah.
written, this doesn't cover the reception of consultation. And I'm being a little nitpicky because I would hate for someone to try and get CEUs and claim something under the purview of consultation where they were thinking that, well, they were receiving supervision.
That's an interesting point. The difference between consultation and supervision can be kind of tricky a little bit. I agree with that. I don't know if I have an answer as to what I would do, but if it's something that they want to do voluntarily, I don't think it's a critical thing to necessarily have this agreement signed if it's something voluntarily. In my opinion, in this situation, in my situation, it definitely was necessary, but not if I don't think in a voluntary situation. I don't think it should be a mandated thing to have that between two professionals. As far as supervision, the way I look at it, with this individual, he knew nothing about the MMPI, for example. So I trained him right from the start how to do everything with the MMPI, all the things I've done in my 49 years of practice, pretty much a long time, and other things as well. And it was helpful to him before he went off on his own. That to me is supervision, something along that line. Go ahead.
So, and precisely with such a situation, if let's take that as an example, if a clinician had no experience in, let's say, projective assessments, and they wanted to get experience in projective assessments, and they sought out supervision from someone, but they are past their terminal degree, and they paid someone to get what they were thinking to be a supervision, and someone is signing their reports. Well, we don't have a mechanism, as far as I know, within regulation that would codify the relationship between the two professionals as a supervisory relationship in the most traditional sense, where the supervisor would be taking on the legal any legal and ethical issues, should there be any, that would arise after the report is written.
That's true. I mean, it's certainly, I realize I was in that situation myself for those 2 years.
So that
absolutely. Yeah.
So that is why I'm asking about G, and specifically the word supervision. And I don't want for us to be in a pickle because regulations, as David had said, regulations can be a bit of a sausage making process and can take a little while to go through the pipelines. And I would rather try and head this off here than wait, you know, a year and a half, and then we would go back to this and say, oh, well, this needs a bit of augmentation because of this situation. Does anyone have any thoughts about this, or do you think that we may need to think this through a little bit? Or do you think this is not much of an issue at all and we should?
I'll say one last thing and I keep my mouth shut. As far as consultation, I would see that as an example. Somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I need your opinion and your advice on a particular matter, and I'm treating this client, blah, 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 and wanting to get my ideas as to how I go about the situation, versus having training, let's say, on the MMPI or WACE 4 or memory skill 4 or whatever. That's where I make the distinction between consultation and supervision personally. For me, it helps objectify it for me as a clinician. But I can see where they can kind of cross path, kind of be similar in a way. So I don't know if you can make that distinction clearly, have a demarcation between consultation and supervision. It can be a fine line.
I kind of feel like the way it's written in the 102, 115 there is a bit of a confusion about the difference between supervision and consultation. I've always understood anytime you receive training from another professional and you're licensed, that's, if it's not education, it's consultation, because you're not legally responsible in the same way that if you sign off, if you're signing off, it's supervision.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think that's clear. I think it's a bit muddled there, in the statute.
And
regulation.
Good point.
That's the thing. If you're signing, you're absolutely right. If you're signing off and you're taking legal responsibility and ethical responsibility, that would be supervision. And we don't have anything in statute or in regulation that codifies the relationship, at least, or codifies such a relationship post degree, at least in terms of anything that I know in Kansas statute or in Kansas regulation. So that's where this kind of comes in. For the sake of brevity, I think that what we can do is, leave it as is. And if we want to return to this at some juncture, we certainly could. I don't want to put too much of a cog in a machine that's already heading down the highway.
No, I certainly think this is a worthwhile. I mean, I think anyone requiring defining what supervision for someone past their terminal degree means, and then once defining that, if someone's receiving supervision, maybe codifying what that means, like we do for people, at a practicum or internship. I think those are important topics. It's, I just think it might take a little, I don't know, set aside some structured time and maybe some sections to read out so we can kind of go through this a little more thoroughly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can return to a discussion about the codification of such a relationship between two professionals post-degree. I'm just writing this down.
So I'm sorry, because again, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me, because after license, like you said, you're not getting supervision. But the one thing that I'm confused by, and maybe I've just misread the continuing education all this time, but I always thought it was about providing supervision, and I just didn't even see that here, so I was confused.
So there's one piece that's about the provision of supervision, and I think there's one piece about the reception of supervision.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
And the regulation for CEUs specifies supervision as defined in 102-1-1. Which, sorry, I'm looking at the CEU reg. So, there's individual clinical supervision, means supervision of the following areas of practice: psychological assessment and therapeutic treatment for individuals or groups, when with the intent of modifying attitudes, emotions, and behaviors that are intellectually, physically, socially, or emotionally maladaptive. And it, I mean, it was there before. You didn't add this. I can tell you how it's used in master's level, because they get a master's, their base license, and then they do a training plan and they do 2 years of supervision. And so they can count some of those supervision hours toward the CEUs. It is different for psychologists because you do your year of postdoc and then you're licensed and you don't require any supervision. So it is different, but I can't tell you why it was already there, that in the CEU regulation. I don't know why it was put there to begin with.
Again, we can return to this. I like Jay's idea of potentially setting aside some time so that we could, further codify or further distill and then codify what supervision would look like post-terminal degree. Because and thank you, Leslie, for reading that. That's actually really helpful, because that does define what supervision would be. It doesn't necessarily speak to this matter of time frame, and that also then gets back to what you were saying about the master's level psychologist. So we can put that aside. That was I won't speak to another question that I had, and I can take it offline. It had to do with the matter of coursework, and I can ask David about it later. But I do want to know if there are any further questions or any further matters that people would want to address when it comes to the draft that Leslie has proposed.
I like it personally. I like to think you've done a really good job overall with this. Very, very good. I personally like it. Absolutely.
All right, well then we'll wait for your discussion on G and how that fits into your CEUs, and it'll be ready besides that. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Leslie. I really appreciate it. I know that it takes a lot of hard work to put these things together. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Very much.
I'll move us along to the second matter of old business. And if I can get back to my screen, that is a discussion on possible changes to the educational requirements. And I'll turn things back over to Dave to kick off that discussion.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, this is a topic that we have talked about a few times. we've been revisiting the educational requirements for licensure that are found in KAR 102-1-12. And I'll go ahead and pull up a copy of that regulation on my screen here. In the past, we've asked the advisory committee members to look at the specific program level requirements and the coursework level requirements to see if those are still appropriate. There was also a conversation about, there is language here that talks about APA accredited programs. There is also conversation the advisory committee has had in support of adding PC-SAS as another national accrediting body, that if someone received their education from a PC-SAS accredited program, that would be something the advisory committee would be in favor of us adding to the regulations as well. I believe there was a conversation either at the board level or maybe at your last meeting that talked about school psychologists. And school psychologists generally are overseen by the Department of Education. But there are some school psychology programs that are APA accredited. And I believe that there was sort of a question as far as whether the language in this regulation was clear enough concerning the distinction between individuals seeking a PhD level, licensed psychology education versus what a school psychologist might be receiving from an APA accredited program, or maybe some language needs to be changed concerning those two, the differences between the two paths from an educational perspective. And Leslie, you were part of that conversation too. I think the master's level psychology program is similarly having a conversation about that. You want to add any kind of clarifying language about that topic as well?
That was actually how it came about. I was speaking to the clinical psychotherapy board member about school psych programs, and he felt that that was different than when you're trained to work in mental health. And I pointed out that the LP regulation says if it's APA accredited, they don't even look at the coursework. So school psychology program is licensable for a licensed psychologist. We license people that came from APA accredited school psych programs. I don't know how those differ. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist, so I am not sure if there's a problem. But he was concerned that they are trained differently, and he wanted to bring that to the attention of the psychology advisory committee.
So there are a number of matters that we could begin in terms of a discussion. And David, there's also, as we had briefly discussed in our meeting prior to this, there's also the matter of GRE scores and whether or not the requirement for GRE scores should stand, because some universities are no longer requiring GRE scores for admission, and our statutes speak to the necessity to have some sort of admissions testing be on board.
Yeah, and we did have a conversation about that. Part of this kind of comes down to, if you look here under KAR 102-1-12, section B, the language here states, if the applicant began the program after March 10th, 2006, the accredited program shall require a certain number of coursework in substantive areas identified in such section, or the equivalent number of quarters of trimester credit hours be completed while the applicant is in residence. If not so accredited, the doctoral degree program from which the applicant was granted the degree shall meet all the following criteria. So basically, if someone came from a non-accredited program, then their program would need to meet all of the following requirements. And if any of these requirements was not met, that would be something the board would have to evaluate if the individual came from a non-accredited program and then they were trying to meet the requirements for licensure in Kansas, we would have to use this regulation. And it's not, there is no language that says it would have to be substantially compliant with these. It says that it would have to meet all of the following ones. So what we've kind of asked the advisory committee to look at is, for each of these items, is it necessary to be included in a regulation like this? Because the reason I frame it that way is because if the program didn't meet any of the following items, that would be a reason that the board should deny the license application for that person. So while some of these might be positive things, or maybe a high gold level standard, the question really is the absence of any of these significant enough to deny a license for someone? And one of the items that we talked about here was, let's see. Item number 18. The program has admissions requirements that are in full or in part based on objective standardized achievement tests and measures. And as there has been a shift, at least in some programs, on moving away from having the standardized test be the pathway for admission, that's kind of why we wanted some of these things to be evaluated. Maybe these all were appropriate back when this was first created, but as some of these regulations have not been updated in several years, it's a good idea for us to be looking at all these items. Again, if somebody came from an accredited program, it wouldn't have to meet all of these kind of items, but for those that come from non-accredited programs, that's kind of what we're looking at here to see if all of these are necessary for someone to meet.
And as it stands, APA has redone their accreditation standards, and the way our regulation is written, someone from an APA program wouldn't necessarily be able to meet our requirements that we have for non-accredited, because they have taken away the requirement for like 3 hours in ethics, or 3 hours, a 3 semester credit hour course in ethics, or they have outcome based measures now. So that we're going to have to look at that as well.
Yeah, and just to be clear, having just gone through a site visit, the accreditation standards still require training in ethics. It's just
Right.
not narrowly defined as a 3 credit hour course. So I think that's really challenging for state licensing boards, because there isn't a specific quantitative definition of that. So I agree, it's very challenging. My overall opinion is this is a lot. And it doesn't necessarily map on to, for example, verification of degrees that occur, and I'm sure Ned does these too through ASPPB, where it's broken down. There are requirements, but it's a lot less than these. And so I would agree, probably working toward something that is less narrow and less onerous would be a really good idea, and particularly given where the GRE has gone with a lot of programs. I think the concern I have is that we have to have standards that do, I think, take a look at degrees that are obtained in a program that actually does justice to getting full competent training in psychology. So it's somewhere in between.
Another thing I wanted to ask or bring up to the committee is, in the past, and we had not completed going through the regulations, but in the past, in section B, it says that even if a program is APA accredited, they have to show that they had certain coursework in residence. And in the past, the committee had been leaning toward removing that, because you either accept the accreditation because it's more and more rigorous, or we don't. And so I just wanted to bring that up. If the committee feels that it should be APA or PCSAS or whatever you use, and they have to have coursework in residence, or if it should be accredited by these two things, and then if not, they meet the other standards.
Well, APA does have a minimum requirement for in-residence training. So, I mean, those things aren't mutually exclusive, at least from my standpoint.
Well, but the way ours is written is it has to be at the institution. And Fielding doesn't have an institution. They meet in different places, so it doesn't meet our requirements. I mean, they're the only one I specifically know that's on more online, more distance learning.
Yeah, APA, I mean, it's required that you're in residence for a certain amount of your training in terms of time, and certainly for the practicum component as well.
Mhm.
Right. So yeah, so that was part of the reason I wanted you guys to look at B.
Sarah, I'm less familiar with the graduate, requirements. So Fielding is just as an example, if they don't have any residency requirement, how do they get by APA if it says you gotta do that?
I don't understand that, having read those very carefully recently.
That
Well, doesn't Capella have the same issue? Because aren't they almost entirely online? Or am I
they are,
I would guess they have really good attorneys that say these sites, these satellites, whatever they are, Leslie, then meet that requirement, and that's having
right.
APA accredited accreditation standards is my best guess.
Yeah, I believe so. Capella's not APA yet that I know of. But yes, so for accreditation purposes, Fielding meets. And so it must be, I would assume that they count their where they meet at hotels or wherever they meet for certain amount of times that is included in their residence, but it doesn't meet the definition in our regulation. So. And most people would assume if they go to an APA accredited program, they could get a license anywhere in the United States. So it's.
my first thought was the at least when it comes to the kind of going line by line or starting at the top is kind of examining under B where it says this doctoral program was accredited by the American Psychological Association, and adding PC-SAS to that, given that we are moving in that direction. That would be the first thing and maybe the easiest
Yeah.
the easiest thing with respect to with respect to augmenting these regulations. And if anybody has any thoughts or any debate about that, I'm open to hearing it. All right, well, we could add that in. I think that as we've been talking about this, a review of what ASPPB, as Sarah has said, what their criteria are for and I just drew a blank. Sarah, could you say that again with respect to ASPP?
Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now. I have to do these seems like every week, but I'm sure it's not that often. But I have to do these attestations. So they have some, I'm not saying this would be definitive, but they do have some language that's similar to this, but a lot less. I guess it's just less, it's more concise. It doesn't cover all of these components, so I'm pulling this up real quick to read to you, but basically, did the program require each student to complete at least 2 of the 3 years at the institution where the degree was granted? Did the program require each student to complete at least 1 year full-time residence on campus at the institution where the degree was granted? Was there an identifiable full-time psychology faculty in residence at the institution and employed in providing instruction at the home campus of the institution? Again, I guess that could be a hotel, Leslie. Was there a psychologist responsible for the program, either as an administrative head or as an advisor, major professor, or committee or chair of the above applicant? Did the program maintain a clear authority and primary responsibility for the core and specialty areas, whether or not the program crossed administration lines? Did the program have an identifiable body of students in residence at the institution who were matriculated in the program for a degree? And did the doctoral program include supervised practicum, internship, field experience, or laboratory training opportunities to the area of psychology practice that was supervised by a psychologist? So you have to attest to all of those when you do license verification. And so, I mean, again, that's kind of their list. I'm not saying that the list for Kansas should be that small, but that's just an example. So I don't know how fielding makes it, Leslie, but I'm sure when there's a will, there's a way, and a lot of money.
Someone said they sued. I don't know if that's correct, but
Mhm.
I have heard that.
And yeah, that list, that does make things quite a bit more concise. And there's the matter, I think, Sarah, of what you were saying earlier too about some of the components regarding what some
Well,
of the
I also think it's really hard to write regulations, I would just guess, that map onto curriculum, because curriculum is going to evolve and change over time.
yes, I was just about to say
Yeah,
the
so
curriculum
specifying
component.
things to courses and things like that. So APA, like I said, doesn't even specify you must have a course to satisfy this requirement. So I would think, Leslie, you're absolutely correct about that. That's going to be really difficult to maintain something that's that highly specific about curriculum.
Mhm.
And the curriculum piece, and I was just searching for curriculum matters begin at number 13. And more like 12. 12 talks about a minimum of 3 years of full academic, 3 full-time academic years of graduate study or the equivalent, and to complete an internship that meets requirements of paragraph B11. And then it goes full-blown into curriculum under 13.
And we do have the requirement of 2 of the 3 years must be at the school, at that institution that grants the degree.
So and it goes on for quite a bit
Yes.
in delineating the specific things that a program must do in terms of its curriculum and in terms of its course if it is not accredited. And as David said, if the program does not do one of those things, that applicant's application gets bumped to the full board for for examination or for review to determine whether or not the licensure application goes through.
Boy, it feels like we're really opening up a can of worms here. It sounds like every time somebody comes through and tries to get licensed that's from an unaccredited program, you practically have to determine whether to accredit the program or not, you know, with all of this language. I almost want to make it, and would require a substantial modification, but make it consistent with the APA. I mean, if we're going to have standards, you know, why not make them the APA standards? If we're accrediting the person's program anyway, why not map it right onto the competencies and expectations of APA, since that's essentially what we're doing, right? And that would get, sorry, go ahead, Les.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I think that initially that's how it was written. But they have changed since then and it hasn't. The last time it was changed, it didn't update all of that APA has updated. So yeah, it is. That's what people tell us. So basically you want me to send you enough information that you could accredit my program. And yes, that's what we need.
And to let you all know, these regulations were last amended, I was in graduate school, in April of 2008. So
And that was just the in residence when we added the requirement for having coursework in residence. So
oh wow. So so the last amendment period was 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't speak to the curriculum matters that we're just discussing.
Right. That was in 98 or 2000 was the curriculum stuff.
Well, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
It does make sense to have it consistent with APA, like you said, with everything. It would just make it a lot easier to keep track of and keep it more uniform. I really support that. So I listen to you talk, even though I've been out of graduate school for 50 years plus. So
Yeah, I think one of the issues is from a licensing perspective, a coursework model is much cleaner to evaluate because we can get the transcripts and be able to check those courses. And if there's some question about a specific course, we can reach out for guidance, but we can move those through pretty quickly. Asking us to evaluate competencies from different programs is a much harder task. For entities that go through the accreditation process, you know, that makes sense that they could be looking at that. But when we're asked to do that for each applicant who comes from a non-accredited school, that's going to be kind of challenging.
yes, that's true.
And also, we want to be fair to everybody and be consistent. And it's a lot easier to be consistent when we have coursework. But if the accrediting bodies are switching to a different model, I think we're not the only state to be wrestling with this. And there's been groups and task force looking at how to standardize this, but they haven't really come out with recommendations yet. So.
Well, and I think also just you name very specific courses. So again, it could be courses in content areas or domains, and courses or practicum training or however you want to define it. But I think having these highly specific a course in this area and it's a course each time is really not the model that has evolved over the past 25 years. So
something else that you also have to consider if you use both APA and PC SAS, you'll want to, I don't know that using all APA standards will work because someone who models their program after PC SAS then would not meet licensure requirements possibly. So it kind of has to be somewhere in the middle. So there's going to be a lot of work in this regulation.
Yeah, I suppose the other option would be is to have one that would say either meet the requirements in item A, and then item A can be modeled after APA, and then item B could be modeled after PC SAS. But like Leslie said, it probably will require a lot of work to go ahead and flush those out.
So this won't be a quick one.
Yeah, I was just about to say, so this will take some time. It will take some thought. And also as a point of reference, there are wonderful folks who review the syllabi and the transcripts of those who submit applications from unaccredited programs, and they do a fantastic job of the evaluation of those applications. And I think that, you know, the degree to which we are precise in our process, we will certainly do a good favor to the folks who do these that do these analyses, and that is to say that they do a fantastic job as it is when it comes to these applications that come across their desks. And I've seen that across disciplines. So.
I'm curious, how frequently does this happen? Is it a common occurrence for people to request licensure from unaccredited programs?
So it depends. It has not been an issue we haven't had any in the last couple of years that were, I mean, we've had some from foreign degrees, but we haven't had any from the US in the last couple of years. Kind of goes in waves. I mean, I remember there was one program that we kept getting applicants from Illinois, but they were actually in the process of getting accredited, so they were able to supply all the documents and it wasn't too bad. But not as many as in other professions.
Mm-hmm.
I do think occasionally we will see some online programs that may not be APA accredited, and those do require us to do the analysis. So we see much more non-accredited programs in other professions, such as professional counseling, that attempt to meet the alternative requirements. And so we've had that advisory committee looking at sort of updating some of that terminology and looking to see what's appropriate to be changed and what's not. But I think part of this discussion too was it sounded like there are certain programs that may be considering dropping APA accreditation and going with PC SAS accreditation instead. And so I think adding the PC SAS as an accrediting body helps to address that issue in part. And also, I think for the social work profession, there was also the discussion of their accreditation process takes about 3 to 4 years. So for new programs, some students are caught in that little window where they go through their program before it actually reaches accreditation status. They have something separate called candidacy for accreditation, and we kind of worked through that for social workers. So thankfully, the other accrediting bodies move more quickly through the accreditation process, so they don't really have the same factor. But the issue is if we do find sort of that pocket where we would get a number of applicants from non-accredited schools, and then we have no way to license them, then things get really challenging for those students and everybody else. Trying to be proactive on these topics.
And one sort of appendix to all of this, with respect to programs, graduate programs discontinuing their APA accreditation and moving on to PC SAS only, my alma mater, the University of Washington, I'm doing a presentation via Zoom tomorrow, and I was just looking at the psychology department website, and they are sort of intimating that they may drop their own APA accreditation and only do PC SAS. And we are seeing that some of the more research intensive programs, such as Berkeley and Ohio State, they have indeed dropped their APA accreditation and only doing PCSAS. So I think that it does behoove state boards to move in the direction of accepting PCSAS as an accrediting body. But that is just my opinion. I don't speak for the opinion of the entire licensing advisory committee in that regard. So, Leslie, I think that we have we've got a fair bit of work to do in this regard, and we can return to this in our next advisory committee, and you'll have some information for us from the American Psychological Association when it comes to what they are now doing for their competency, not evaluation, but the way in which they are doing competencies across domains, so that folks can get their degrees, and we'll integrate that into this document, or begin the process of doing that in our next advisory committee meeting.
Okay.
All right. So on to new business, unless there are other topics to discuss on old business. All right. Well, on to new business. The first item is a discussion on possible survey, excuse me, for licensed psychologists. And Dave, I'll have you introduce this topic.
Okay. So in your packet of materials, I included a little 62-page report. And some of you may have wondered why you received that. That is because for the social work profession, from time to time, they ask us to do surveys of licensees looking at different topics, collecting data. And so this year we provided a survey and we created a report summarizing the data we received and analyzed it. And so that report is what we were able to put together for the social workers. This year, for us to do one and really be able to put it out for all of the social workers, we signed an agreement for the year with SurveyMonkey to be able to do essentially a survey for all of the different professions under the BSRB. And so we are talking to each of the advisory committees to see if there's interest in sending a survey out to their licensees. And so I thought that might be helpful for you to see sort of what we asked the social workers. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. I'll show you on page 2 of that survey report. It lists all the questions that were part of that survey. And we ask a few to ensure that we have a fair sampling of respondents to the survey. For social work, there was roughly about 8,288 social workers licensed at the time. We were able to open the survey for about a period of 10 days. And we were able to have a way to send reminders to anyone who didn't respond to the initial invitation to take the survey. And so we could follow up with those people and send them a couple reminders, give them another opportunity. But over the course of that time period, we had a really good response rate. I want to say we had close to 2,700 to 2,800 social workers who took the survey. And so really good response rate. We had some questions that sampled those individuals to talk about if they worked in a predominantly urban area, rural area. Also, we asked them the levels of licensure they had attained. And then we asked them a series of questions on different topics. Some of those had to do with, if Kansas passed the multi-state compact for social work, would you want to move to a multi-state license? Also, we asked individuals about their licensing examination and the importance of that examination as a requirement for licensure in Kansas. We asked them questions about individuals providing and also individuals receiving supervision by televideo rather than just in person. And if they've noticed positive changes or outcomes, negative outcomes or otherwise. And then part of that information we collected was narrative. So we allowed individuals to use their own word to give us feedback. We also asked them questions about continuing education and possible change for that profession in terms of lowering the numbers, and if they thought a potential lowering from 40 hours every 2 years to 30 hours every 2 years would negatively affect professionalism and safe practice. So in the report, some of this information we were able to summarize in nice, clean pie charts. and others, we allowed individuals to just tell us whatever they wanted to tell us as far as feedback. So that explains kind of the length of the report. But the way that we did this for the social work profession is we had a meeting where we talked about possible topics for a survey. And then I was able to develop some draft questions to bring back to the advisory committee. And then the advisory committee looked at those draft questions. They were able to identify ones they liked, modify the language. And then ultimately, when we had a good set of questions, I was able to send that out to licensees, collect feedback. And then when I got that back, I was able to clean up the data and format it in the form of a report. So if you think that there would be topics relevant to collect information back from licensed psychologists in Kansas, that is something we could do. And I think a similar format might work. We at the next meeting, if you thought this would be a good idea, we could talk about topics for a survey. And then in between that meeting and the following one, I could work on the draft questions. And then we could critique, modify those questions and fix those up, and then potentially issue that survey and collect the data for you to review. And that could be a good point of emphasis for future changes, or if there's a proposed change and you wanted feedback on that, that would be something else you could do.
Any thoughts or questions about doing a survey or putting out a survey to our colleagues across Kansas? And if so, anything that you would want to hear about preliminarily?
I might have missed it, but David, what was the modality? Like, was it Qualtrics, or what modality was it?
We used a company called SurveyMonkey.
Okay, SurveyMonkey, thanks.
Yeah.
I would say I think it's good to find out what licensed psychologists think about the profession in the state of Kansas, and I would keep it short and use a survey system that's easy to respond to, like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or whatever, and perhaps getting some feedback from different constituents, because again, I just don't know that and again, people on this board, I might have a viewpoint about folks that are in academic settings and medical centers, but I wouldn't have as much about other areas. So
for this report with the 14 questions, it told us it took people on average about 7 to 8 minutes to complete, just for kind of that reference.
Yeah, I think for any kind of response rate, yeah, it's gonna have to be super brief.
And could you remind me, Dave, the percentage of people or the percentage of social workers that completed it? Was it 20%?
It was greater than that. We had about 8,200 social workers, or 8,288. The number that responded back to it was about 2,800. I think 2007, 2,800, somewhere in that range. So not
Around
quite.
a third of the people, roughly a little over a third.
Okay. The previous survey we did about 3 years ago, of course, there were fewer social workers, but not drastically different. And we got about 1,000 responses back. So we got some different techniques this time. We kept the survey open a little bit longer. One of the things we were able to use with SurveyMonkey is we were able to send out targeted reminders. So we were able to basically, one of the nice things about that survey company is we were able to send it to everyone directly. So we knew that who was responding back to it was actually the licensee, that this wasn't something where someone put the link on a message board and then who knows who was responding to it. So it was specifically sent to those individual licensees. And then once they had responded to it, they were no longer eligible to respond back to it again. And so we could send follow-ups to anybody who hadn't responded to it yet. So that was helpful, I thought.
I imagine most of the people on this call, I'm kind of a fan of data. So if this isn't something that's been done at all or recently, I would even wonder if you could start it with like 4 open-ended questions. As a psychologist in the state of Kansas, what are your concerns? What are your interests? What are your motivation? Whatever. Something to just even gets at, who out there has an idea that nobody's really thinking about or something, right?
I would support mixed methods. I think coding qualitative data is quite challenging and difficult. So I would suggest some data that is quantitative and easy to gather and quantify, and some qualitative, but more limited, because that's so much more difficult for any kind of limited staffing to discern what the themes are.
It sounds like generally folks are or would be interested in doing this. I have offline I've said to Dave that I would be interested in having a survey constructed and sent out. And if we could get a really good response rate, I think that could provide us with some useful data around what psychologists in Kansas might be thinking about in terms of either the state of the profession here in Kansas or what the BSRB could be doing differently when it comes to licensing psychologists in Kansas, whatever the case may be. I think that the timeline that has been proposed in terms of what we could do in terms of rollout sounds good to me, and that would mean that we would begin this in earnest in our next advisory committee meeting in June.
That's right.
So
I got one other question, and I may be totally launching this in the wrong direction, but I am not overwhelmingly connected to KPA. I don't know who is. I don't know how connected people are to it. But I understand them to be kind of the other side of the lobbying side of supporting the profession and whatnot. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on, even if there's, information that they would have that would give us similar kinds of data or interests or whatever, kind of thinking about, again, supporting the profession, not just, having, what are your concerns necessarily?
no, that's a really good point and kind of question, Matt. So I think that there are maybe a couple of us on here who are who have interconnections with KPA. I'm seeing some head nods. I personally don't, but I do know some people who are in KPA. We could certainly have a conversation with, or I certainly can reach out to somebody in KPA and have a conversation with them about the possibility of having this go out. That would be something that could be done.
Yeah, several of us are on the board. It looks like Ned's unmuting. He's probably the longest term, maybe. I don't know. Ned, are you the longest term member? KPA here?
I don't know, but well, this is giving me ideas about, maybe KPA thinking about a survey from another perspective, like Richard is saying. I think the issue overall is just what do we want to ask, and I'm not sure, thinking about this group. KPA, I think they're probably actually clearer. I can think of a lot of things that they might ask in a survey. I'm not sure what this group would want to know.
I personally like a number of the questions that the social workers come up with on page 2. My own personal feeling. I'm sure there'll be other questions that could come up that we could help quantify, but personally, I like a lot of what they've come up with. And if it only took 8 minutes for them to complete all those questions, that's pretty brief, I think.
I could be jumping ahead because I saw on the agenda that there was a discussion about the jurisprudence exam. Am I too far ahead in assuming that might be a good topic to have on a survey if we were to have a survey? But then again, I don't know what the discussion is about, so I'm jumping ahead.
That would, so no, Tiffany, you are not jumping ahead. We are just about out of time, and that would be a good question to ask on such a survey.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
I am sure that people have thoughts and feelings about whether or not there should be a jurisprudence in the state of Kansas.
That is a great question, Tiffany.
Yes, I
Excellent.
concur. That's a fantastic question.
Yes. I agree.
And it is 8 o'clock on the nose. So I will wrap us up on this. We've got a couple of items of new business that we'll return to. We'll shelve them for this meeting.
Richard, if you have like 20 seconds, I think I can cover one of those topics, then they would keep us on a time frame.
Yes.
Okay. The topic as far as new members, generally around this time of year, if there's opening on the advisory committee, I send a message out to licensees just saying the advisory committee is seeking interested individuals, give a letter of interest or a CV or a resume, and then you can self-nominate yourself for consideration. The advisory committee will review those applicants and then make recommendations for membership spots. And Rodney McNeil, his term on the advisory committee, his fourth term is ending at the end of June, so you will have at least one spot opening up there. And I think that's the only spot that would be available. So if it's okay with you, I'll just go ahead and send out that customary message to licensees, collect that information in between now and your June meeting. That way you can talk about new applicants for the advisory committee at that next meeting. That sounds good.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. With that said, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I motion to adjourn.
Mark, and do I have a
Second.
second? All right. Well, I think that'll pass unanimously. I won't take much of a vote on that. We'll see you all on Tuesday, the 11th of June, 2024 at 6 p.m. Y'all have a good rest of your night.
Thank you for all
Likewise.
your help.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.